The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. So I've changed the Gospel reading today to accord with the topic I want to address, and I've stitched together two passages from John, a piece from chapter 15 and a piece from chapter 17. And there's one phrase that keeps repeating again and again and again and again. See if you can pick it up. If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. They will treat you this way because of my name, because they do not know the one who sent me. Father, I have revealed you to those whom you gave me out of the world. They were yours. You gave them to me, and they have obeyed your word. I pray for them. I am not praying for the world, but for those you have given me, for they are yours. All I have is yours, and all you have is mine. I will remain in the world no longer, but they are still in the world, and I am coming to you. Holy Father, protect them by the power of your name, the name you gave me, so that they may be one as we are one. While I was with them, I protected them and kept them safe by the name that you gave me. I am coming to you now, but I say these things while I am still in the world, so that they may have the full measure of joy within them. I have given them your word, and the world has hated them, for they are not of the world any more than I am of the world. My prayer is not that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. They are not of the world, even as I am not of it. Sanctify them by the truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, I have sent them into the world. For them, I sanctify myself, so that they too may be sanctified. The gospel inspired by God. In a nation which had more than its fair share of great mystics and great poets, Al-Kabir was among the cream of the crop. He was born in 1440 and he died in 1518, an extraordinary mystic and a great, great poet. In fact, he had a huge influence on one of the main branches of Hinduism. There are 4 great yogas in Hinduism. The 4 yogas are Jnana Yoga, which is the path of the mind, finding God through the mind, and Bhakti Yoga, which is finding God through the heart, it's having a love affair with God, and Karmic Yoga, which is social justice or action in the world, and Raja Yoga, which is meditation. Al-Kabir had an extraordinary influence, particularly on Bhakti Yoga. Bhakti Yoga is the path of devotion or falling in love with God, as distinct from just figuring out who God is or meditating on the mystery of God. And his name actually is from the Arabic. Al-Kabir in Arabic literally means the great one. And in fact, among the 99 names of God, the great one, Al-Kabir, is name number 37. And his story is very interesting. He was born to a Brahmin family, but he was orphaned at a very early age. And he was adopted by a Muslim family who were weavers, so he grew up as a weaver, trained as a weaver. And at some stage in his adult life, he encountered the teaching of Jesus Christ, and he fell in love with the mystic Jesus as well. So he practiced 3 great traditions, Hinduism, Islam, and Christianity. And in fact, when he died, there was a huge dispute broke out between his Muslim followers and his Hindu followers. They both wanted to take the body, and ritually dispose of it according to their own tradition. So the Muslims wanted to take it and bury it. That's how Muslims, deal with the dead. The Hindus wanted to take it and cremate it because that is how Hinduism deals with its dead. And so they're literally fighting over the corpse. And at one stage in the struggle, they pull the sheet off the body and they find out there's nobody there. There's a whole mound of flowers. And so they divide the mound of flowers between them, and the Hindus cremate their part of it, and the Muslims bury their part of it. So that was the great saint and the great mystic and the great poet Al-Kabir. But he had a fascination with this great mystic called Jesus of Nazareth. And in one famous statement, he says one time, speaking about Jesus, he says, Jesus, blessed be his name, once said, life is a bridge. Cross over it, but do not build your house upon it. And that's what I want to focus on today. This reading that I stitched together today, there was one phrase that kept repeating, and if you were counting, it repeated 17 times. Just in those two little passages that I put together, the phrase, the world, is repeated 17 times. So I'm going to make 4 main points this morning. I'm going to talk about the world, and then I'm going to talk about Christ consciousness, and thirdly, I'm going to talk about the mission, and finally, I want to talk about the name. So firstly, I want to address the notion of the world. There are very few phrases in the Christian scriptures, in my opinion, which are as frequently misunderstood as this phrase, the world. Listening to Jesus this morning, you think he really, really had it in for the world. And he did, when you understand what the world means in the teaching of Jesus Christ. But the Christian message has constantly misunderstood what the phrase the world means. And so very, very often, the world means one of two things in Christian theology. Firstly, we think that the world is actually the physical planet or nature. And somehow that's bad, that nature is intrinsically evil, or that the world is basically bad and needs to be dominated in some way. And so there's a word in the Hebrew scriptures, in the book of Genesis, in chapter 3, where God gives human beings radah over nature. Very simple little Hebrew word, radah. But radah has 3 different meanings. Radah means to dominate, it means to exploit, or it means to have responsibility or stewardship of. And of course, as human beings, we've always taken the first 2 meanings. We think that the world is ours to dominate and to exploit. And so very, very often in many religious traditions, there is this notion that the world is evil at worst, and at best it's merely a resource for us. And we're meant, and we have the right to exploit it and to dominate it. And so somehow this world then, in the Christian teaching, is like a prison. It's a prison for the entire species, and our job is to set ourselves free by dominating this world. And so sometimes when the phrase the world is used, we think that that's what Christ is referring to. And he's not referring to that. Christ has a totally different attitude towards the world and towards nature in that sense of the word. But we have totally misunderstood it. We've used this as a pretext, both the phrase in Genesis and the phrase in John, to think that we have the right to exploit or dominate this planet or dominate and exploit nature. That is not what Christ means by this phrase, the world. The second misperception is that we think the world is the physical plane, and particularly our physical bodies, and that somehow the bodies themselves are evil, and that the soul is trapped inside the prison of the body, and that the way to set the soul free is by all manners of asceticism and self-flagellation. And Christ is not saying that either. He is definitely not saying this. But very many, even great thinkers and great mystics at some stage of their journey adopted that belief system. I mentioned just a few of them. The Buddha fell into the trap. After 29 years of living in absolute hedonism and discovering, finally, seeing a sick person, an old person, and a dead person, he leaves the palace where he is raised and he goes out into the world and he wants to find enlightenment. And he thinks that the way to find enlightenment is by ultimate asceticism. He joins a group of wandering sannyasin in the forest, and he's literally learning to live on a single grain of rice a day. He thinks that enlightenment is achieved through ultimate asceticism. So he fell into that trap. After 6 years, he was no nearer enlightenment than when he began. And then he discovered it's not through asceticism and it's not through hedonism. It is through what he called the middle path. The ability to relate to the world as it is, to love it, to celebrate it, but not to identify with it. The second character who fell completely into this trap was John the Baptist. And Jesus makes a very interesting and a very enigmatic statement about John in one of his teachings. He says, of all the men born of women, there is none greater than John the Baptist. And yet I tell you that even the least in the kingdom is greater than John. How can you put these two pieces together? Of all men born of women, there's never been a greater than John the Baptist, but I tell you, the least in the kingdom is greater than John. In other words, Christ is saying, if enlightenment can be achieved through asceticism, nobody has ever done it better than John the Baptist. But enlightenment is not achieved through asceticism. Enlightenment is achieved through compassion and through love. And therefore, the least in the kingdom, the person who understands that the way to God is love and compassion, that person is greater. Any one of those people who get that message, they're greater than John. So John had fallen into this trap as well. And so there's this notion very often when we hear this phrase, the world, that Christ is inveighing mightily against the body or against nature. And he's doing nothing of these. So you get this almost like siege mentality that the world and the body is an evil city that we have to lay siege to and literally smoke them out or starve them out until finally the soul is liberated and we fly off back to God. Christ is not saying any of these things. That is not what he means by the phrase, the world. So what does he mean by the phrase, the world? I'm going to give you 3 hits in it. You can take your pick among them. When Christ talks about the world, to use a Gnostic term, he's talking about the Archons. Archon is a Greek word meaning the rulers. Now I'll give you 3 versions of that, and you can choose among them, whichever makes sense to you. According to the Sumerian tradition, the oldest civilization on the planet, which goes back 3,800 BC, and whose writings, by the thousand have recorded the evolution of their own civilization. It's among the Sumerians for the first time you get mathematics, astronomy, calendar making, kiln making, transport, agriculture, calligraphy, medicine, divorce and marriage as contracts, adoption, taxation, religion, temples, priesthood. They invented all of these things. But in their own writings, they say, we actually didn't invent any of these. We got these from a group of extraterrestrials called the Anunnaki, who came down to planet Earth 445,000 years ago to mine gold. And they upgraded a hominid species as a slave group. So they interfered genetically with them and they upgraded them so that they would work in their mines. And so Homo sapiens arrived as a genetically modified hominid, courtesy of the Anunnaki, according to the Sumerian tradition. And this slave race was initially pressed into mining in South Africa. And then later they were brought in as gardeners in the Middle East, and then they became domestic servants, and then finally they were pressed into armed conflict. In the internecine warfare that happened between these Anunnaki families, human beings were now pressed into military service. And so one version of the Archons, when Christ talks about the world, he's talking about that. The overlords, the pretend to be gods. Because these beings were so technologically advanced, they were regarded as gods. And that is still a phenomenon of planet Earth. There's a phenomenon called the cargo cults, whereby whenever a very primitive society encounters a very technologically sophisticated civilization, they worship them as gods. And that happened during World War II, when both Japanese and American airmen landed in some of the small Polynesian islands. The local people literally thought they were gods, and they worshipped them. And these gods came down with a whole bunch of cargo, which they dispensed among the natives. And so when the war was ended, and these gods had gone back to the skies where they belonged, the locals would create all kinds of rituals to try to entice them back down. And they're known as the cargo cults. So whenever you get a very sophisticated civilization encountering a very primitive group, the primitive group will always regard them as gods of some kind. So the Sumerian account, they made gods of these extraterrestrials. So that's one version, that the Archons represent some kind of advanced civilization, an off-planet group who visited here, enslaved a group of hominids, upgraded them slightly, pressed them into service, and then went back home. And now we still regard these as the gods. So when Jesus talks about the world, he's talking about this misperception, these false gods that enslave us still. So that's one hit. If you like that one, take it. If you don't, listen for the next one. The next one is that the world represents the 0.1%. 147 corporations own 85% of all the resources on planet Earth right now. Among those 147 corporations, 85 individuals own 50% of the world's resources right now. That is the second level of the Archons are the world. There are people and corporations who care nothing for the 99.9% who suffer, for the middle class that's getting squeezed out of existence, or the fact that there are 6,000 little babies dying of hunger every day. They could care less because compassion is atrophied in these people. So in some senses, that is the world of which Jesus speaks. This total uncaring attitude of those, some kind of an elite, some kind of a corporatocracy, some kind of banksters who continue to oppress the 99.99% and could care less about human suffering. So that's a second hit on it. They represent the world that Christ is talking about, a total disregard for humanity and for suffering creatures. The third possible hit is this. They may be etheric beings, non-physical entities who continue to interact with this planet. Now, reality exists in many dimensions, all the ways from really, really dense stuff like rocks to subtler stuff like flowers, to subtler stuff like human beings who can think, maybe to angelic beings who are pure thought forms. We exist at many, many, many different levels. But basically, we're all reduced to energy. If I take this bench here and I break it down to its molecular structure, and I take each molecule and reduce it to its atoms, and I take the atoms and reduce it to subatomic particles and break it down further, I'm left with just pure energy. This is Einstein's famous formula, E equals mc squared. Everything reduces down to energy. And everything is energy. You know, every single human being has their own significant vibrational frequency. Every organ in your body has a different frequency. Your heart has a frequency. Your brain has a frequency. Everything about you has a frequency. Your thoughts have a frequency. Your emotions have a frequency. So you're constantly giving off these frequencies. And if you're living in love and living in compassion, you're giving off a frequency which is healing the planet. If you're living in fear or anxiety or sadness or depression or anger, you're giving off a different frequency which is also affecting everybody else. Now, there's something about human beings that we somehow learn to feed off the negative energy of other human beings. This is really, really devastating, but it's actually true. What is it about human beings that they can force animals to fight each other and get pleasure from the pain that they encounter? When you put a toreador in a ring and you're going to kill a bull and watch this creature suffering to death and the whole crowd is cheering, what is being fed in us at that stage? What emotional need is being filled by watching an animal get tortured? Or you put two dogs fighting each other, or two roosters fighting each other. And then you watch, or you get two guys inside in the ring with ultimate fighting, bare knuckle, beating the crap out of each other, and a whole crowd around shouting for blood. What is it about us that feeds, emotionally and etherically and energetically from the pain of other people? It's a real part. I remember as a small little boy in the schoolyard, I'm about 6 or 7 years old, having some kind of an altercation with another guy, and all of a sudden, we're pushed into the center, and a whole group of kids gathered around, and they're shouting, fight, 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 fight. So they're doing two things. They're alerting everybody else there's a fight going to happen, gather around and witness, and secondly, encouraging the two of us to go at each other. And of course, like any little boy at this stage, you're wrestling with two kinds of fear. The fear of losing face if you're conquered, and the fear of getting into a fight. And you're oscillating between these two kinds of fears, and the whole mob is feeding off of this kind of thing. Now, even if as human beings we have this, satanic impulse to feed off the suffering of other human beings, is it possible that there are etheric beings whose raison d'être is to feed off the suffering of the species, of human species? Is that what Christ is talking about when he talks about the world? So not only are they kind of surreptitiously or kind of opportunistically feeding off negative anxiety when it comes, but maybe they're even cultivating it in the same way that human beings have domesticated crops or domesticated animals so that we didn't have to travel to feed ourselves. We could grow our food right here or keep our crop or animals right here, so we had easy access to our food system. Is it possible that there are entities that are actually cultivating this, not just opportunistically feeding upon it, but actually cultivating it and creating all kinds of fear, all kinds of anxieties? How else can we explain the human predilection for warfare over the last 5,000 years? No matter how many wars we fight, it never seems to be enough. We have to be involved in wars non-stop, it seems. What's being fed there? Two things are being fed. Firstly, some group is learning to dominate by dividing and conquering us and getting rich in the process, because a lot of people get rich from war. But more importantly, maybe it's satisfying some kind of a demonic urge to feed upon the pain and the suffering of sentient beings. So when Christ talks about the world and rejecting the world, he's talking about, in my opinion, one of those three things, or maybe a combination or all of them. So take your pick. That's my first point. My second point then, I want to talk about Christ consciousness. When the Christ comes then, he's obviously coming to address this issue of the world, whichever category of the world you choose to kind of believe in. So what does it mean for Christ when the Christ figure comes? You look at Christ and you look at his attitude towards the world, in the sense of nature or the planet. And his attitude is one of total love and appreciation. He will say stuff like, look at the lilies of the field. And he's not just saying, give a cook, just give a glance. He's saying, I really want you guys to look at the lilies of the field. Because if you understand a lily, you understand God. One of the most powerful homilies that the Buddha ever gave. On one occasion, there's a whole bunch of his followers watching him. They're waiting for a homily. And he bends down and he picks up a flower and he puts it in the air. And they're watching it. And they're waiting for him to start. And he's holding it up there. He's not saying a word. And they're still watching. Say, okay, dude, get on with it. What are you going to say? Tell us about it. And he's just watching. And all of a sudden, one of the disciples around the back begins to smile. He gets it. And the Buddha says, you understand it. Because the truth is, if you really, really saw a flower, you'd see God. If you really, really understood a lily, you'd understand God. If you really understood any natural phenomenon in its core essence, you would understand God. And Christ is saying that when Christ says, look at the lilies of the field, or he says something like, don't you guys sell sparrows 2 for a penny in your marketplaces? And still I tell you, not a single sparrow falls from the sky without your heavenly Father being aware of it. And so Christ's attitude towards nature is antithetical, is 180 degrees out from what the churches so often teach, that Christ is against nature or against the world. The exact opposite is totally the truth. So what then, when Christ says the world and he invades against the world, is he talking about the body? You look at Christ's attitude towards the body, and he spent his entire public ministry feeding the hungry and healing the sick. If he believed that the body was a prison, that you need to smoke out the soul by ascetically punishing the body, he wouldn't have been feeding people and he wouldn't have been healing people. But his entire public ministry was about feeding the hungry and healing the sick. So his attitude, the attitude of Christ's consciousness, is antithetical to the notion that nature is evil or that the body is bad. Au contraire, when Christ talks about nature, about the world, his attitude is that our journey is a journey from being in a trance to being awake, from free will to freedom, and from self-concern to compassion for all sentient beings. And so the primary virtue of all, I believe, is more important even than love, is being awake. The most important virtue of all is coming awake. Because if I'm not awake, what I think is love is mere mawkish sentimentality. Unless I'm really awake, love is only mawkish sentimentality. So the very first virtue of all is being awake, which is why Gautama Siddhartha, when he's interrogated, he identified himself by a single word. I am Buddha. I am awake. And Christ again and again and again in his parables will say stuff like, if the householder knew at what stage the thief was going to break in and steal, he'd stay awake. So the first virtue of all is staying awake. But we're caught in this cultural trance. As a species, we're caught in this cultural trance. We live a soporific life where we're fed bread and circuses to keep us quiet. So the very first virtue is coming awake. That's where Christ consciousness was. The very first stage of Christ consciousness is coming awake to the reality of the world, the situations in which we find ourselves. And the second one is the movement from free will to freedom. They're very different. Free will is the ability to do as I please. Freedom is the ability to do as pleases God. And so the only truly free person is the person who's opting again and again and again to do the loving, compassionate thing. To the extent that I'm not doing a loving, compassionate thing, I'm not free. I'm enthralled to something, some addiction of some kind. So I may be exercising free will, but I certainly am not a free person. So that's the second movement of Christ consciousness, from free will to freedom. And the third one is a movement from self-concern to compassion for everything. Now, self-concern is a very important first step in the journey of survival. If a little baby, were not self-concerned, it wouldn't survive infancy. So self-concern is a very necessary stage in the journey, but it's only a very initial stage. It has to give way again and again and again to different levels of compassion. Firstly, for the family, then for the clan, then for the culture, then for the species, then for all sentient beings. So it's this movement from self-concern into compassion for other people. But as Christ points out this morning, the world, in the negative sense of it, does not understand that, does not embrace that, does not like that. And so the world will constantly pit itself sometimes very, very violently against Christ consciousness. And so whenever you're trying to come awake, the world will slap you down. They want to herd you safely under the bell curve. They don't like the outliers, the criminal class who won't keep the law, and the prophetic class who have gone beyond law. They'll cut those off, assassinate them, persecute them, criminalize them, incarcerate them, whatever. And so the world does not want us awake. And the world does not want us free. They want maybe to exercise free will among the consumer goods that they offer to us as the way to happiness. Free will consists in deciding which version of the iPad to buy for Christmas. Yeah? But that's not freedom. So they don't want us free. They want us just to exercise free will among the commodities that they offer to us. And it's not about, they don't want compassion. When you have compassion, how can you go to war? How can you kill anybody if you realize that we're all equally beloved of God? They don't want compassion. They want greedy self-concern in the service of the national security state or whatever the God happens to be at the time. So Christ consciousness will constantly come up against this. It has at the time of Christ, and Christ continued to say, they did it to me and they're going to do it to you. And they're going to keep doing it until finally Christ consciousness has taken hold, until we reach a critical mass in which finally the message is so obvious that even the dumbest of us will wake up, embrace it, and come awake. That's my second point. My third point then is the mission. When you listen to the first reading this morning, the one that Lawrence did for us, you get this Christ commissioning his disciples to heal. Now, if there were two phrases that defined the mission of Christ himself, again and again and again, it would be just to preach good news and to heal sickness. If I were to reduce the entire public ministry of Jesus Christ to two phrases, those would be the two phrases. Christ's mission was about preaching good news and healing sickness. And now he's passing it on this morning, and this is the mission of anybody who calls himself an awake, enlightened being. It is to preach good news and to heal sickness. So let me differentiate between these two for a few minutes. Of what does good news consist? How would you know good news from bad news? Good news creates a cosmology of compassion. It creates a model in which you understand that all of us are equally beloved, manifestations of the divine. And so when Christ talked about good news, he's not talking about all hat, he's talking about good news, a totally different understanding. And this is precisely the injunction, that Ria read for us this morning. Where's Ria sitting? Great. That Ria read for us this morning, when Christ is kissing Mary Magdalene on the lips. Now, he may well have been, a lover of Mary, and that's not an issue whatsoever. Whether or not they were, physically, romantically, intimate, that doesn't matter a damn to me or to any of us when we think about it. But much more importantly, kissing was a sign of the transmission of lineage. When a guru or a teacher meant to hand on a lineage to a disciple who was going to take over, the symbol of initiation and transmission was a kiss. And so you kiss somebody and you impart your words and your wisdom and your lineage to that person. And Mary, par excellence, was the carrier of the lineage of Christ consciousness. I would call her a Christa consciousness person. So Mary represents the carrier forward of this legacy. Because once Christ had died, she was the main bearer. Whether or not she was carrying a physical child of his doesn't matter at all to me. What she was doing was she was carrying this lineage. And according to tradition, she went to France and lived in France for many, many years and preached in France, carrying this lineage to France. So the kissing of Mary Magdalene represents the fact that perhaps she, more than any other human being, understood who Christ was. She, more than any other human being, understood what his message was, and therefore she was the prime candidate to receive the transmission, the oral transmission signified by a kiss. And so Mary understands what it means to preach good news, and she spent the rest of her life preaching the good news of the kingdom, mainly in France. But each one of us has the same purpose. You volunteered for life on planet Earth because you were meant to preach good news. You have to be a source of compassionate energy in your environment, both in the thoughts you think, the words you speak, and the ways in which you behave. And the second part of it had to do then with healing ministry. So there's a very enigmatic phrase this morning where a disguised Christ is meeting the disciples in a foreign place, and he's encouraging them to be healers. And they're really shy. They're having an encounter with a post-resurrected Jesus, and they're not really sure how to be with him. And they're embarrassed, they're shy. So Peter asks one question, and he doesn't really understand the answer, so he nudges, as Lawrence did very powerfully this morning, nudges and says, you ask the next question. So John tries to ask the same question. And what Christ more or less said to them, he said, I understand you're not physicians. He's telling them to go out and heal. And they said, we didn't go to med school. Who's going to take us seriously? And Christ is saying, okay, there are physicians of the world, of the physical body, and there are physicians of the heart and of the soul. So I want you to smuggle donkeys. I want you to pretend to be healers of the body, but really, I want you to be healers of the soul. So the way to get credence somehow and to be accepted as healers is to heal the body first. That's a piece of cake. Very easy to heal the body. And it reminds me of a great story in one of the Gospels where Jesus is inside in a house one day and there's a whole group of people gathered around and they're packed so tightly both in the house and outside the house that nobody can get access. And a group of people bring along a paralyzed man on a stretcher and the crowd won't let him in. Everybody is trying to strain to hear, what is he saying? What does he look like? So they won't let the stretcher in. So the guys have to go up on top of the roof, and the houses are always built with a flat roof, and they start pulling off scraws of dirt and earth and lumber right over Jesus' head, and it's raining on top of him. And he looks up, and they let down the stretcher right in front of him. And this guy is a paralyzed man. And Christ says a very strange thing. He says, my son, your sins are forgiven you. And there's uproar. There's a whole bunch of Pharisees in the crowd, and they're thinking, who can forgive sins? Only God can forgive sins. Who does this guy think he is? And Christ is watching what they're thinking, and he says to them, what do you think is easier, to say to this man down here, your sins are forgiven, or to say, get up, pick up your bed, and walk home? And there's dead silence. He says, okay, I'll show you. One is as easy as the other. So he says to the guy, son, get up, pick up your mat, roll it up, and go home. And the paralyzed man gets up, rolls up his mat, and the waves part like the Dead Sea, and he walks out. So Christ saying, I tell you, it's a lot easier to heal the body than heal the soul. So if you want proof, here's healing the body. So he gives the same injunction to the disciples. I want you to kind of use healing the body as a lever to get into being accepted as soul healers or heart healers. So heal the body. But don't use their medicine. Use a different kind of medicine. A kind of a faith-based medicine. And we still have it strong among us. In medical literature, it's called the placebo. And the placebo accounts for over 30%. Some people would say maybe 50% of all curing happens through the placebo. So you give a pharmaceutical drug to somebody and you give an inert pill to somebody else, and 50% of those who get the placebo will get healed, and maybe 51% of those who got the pharmaceutical. But what they don't factor in is that even the people who got the pill, they also got the placebo because it's what they were thinking. That's what cured them. So if you take the placebo out of the equation, what the pill itself is doing is maybe 5% of the healing. The placebo is doing most of it. Now, the placebo is something which is ignored by Western medicine, although it benefits hugely from it. Because most of the healing that's happening is actually happening because of the mindset of the person who's receiving the pill. Now, there's an opposite thing called the nocebo. So placebo literally means I agree or I please. Nocebo means, I disagree. There's a nocebo effect. You go to a doctor, and the doctor says, it's bad news, you've got stage 4 cancer. I give you 3 months to live. That's called, and the person dies in 3 months. That's called a nocebo, where you agree to the judgment by the medical person, and you give up, and you die. Now, this is a no-lose situation for the doctor, because if you die in 3 months, see, I'm infallible. If you survive for a year, see, I managed to give you an extra shelf life. So one way or the other, the doctor is going to look good. So Christ is talking to this issue, that it is faith that heals us. It's the understanding of how the cosmos works. And this is not to deal in miracles. If you say to me, do I believe in miracles? If by miracle you mean that God temporarily sets aside the laws of the universe in order to indulge the prayers of holy people, no, I do not believe in miracles. If by miracle you mean that the universe is a far more complex phenomenon than we understand it, and therefore there are ways of working with the laws of the universe, which allow extraordinary things to happen, including healings. Yes, I do believe in miracles, because the truth is we're only scratching the surface of our understanding of how the universe actually works. And when Christ talks about faith, that's what he's talking about. Going so deeply that you begin to understand at a much more complex level how the universe actually works, including the ability to heal the body and then heal the soul. And the final point I want to make is, I'm going to call it the name. So he talks about, healing in my name or in the name of the Father. Now, we often think that the name is an identity tag, that the name is something that appears in your driving license or in your birth certificate to distinguish you from somebody else. That is not what your name is. That's an identity tag for purposes of data, collection. It is not your name. I've said to you many, many, many times that your name, your real name, was the song that your soul sang as it wended its way into incarnation. And that song did two things for you. It identified your essence, and it identified your mission or your purpose on planet Earth. So a name has to do with the realization of essence and of mission. So when Christ talks about healing in his name, he's not talking about some kind of an incantation where you just pronounce the name Jesus, and if you get the accent right somehow, bingo, there it happens. He's talking about aligning with the essence of Christ. And if you're aligned with the essence of Christ, you're aligned with the essence of the Father. If you're aligned with the essence of the Father, you're aligned with the essence of the lily. If you're aligned with the essence of the lily, you're aligned with the essence of the self, of your core self. And at that stage, the name is really, really powerful. Because when you're in fullest alignment with your essence and fullest alignment with your purpose, then extraordinary things begin to happen. And that's why in the Hebrew scriptures, you get this real injunction against taking the Lord's name in vain. It's not swearing, or it's not cursing, or not saying bad words. That's not what they mean. It's some effort to try to hijack God's energy for some egoic enterprise. So in actual fact, taking the Lord's name in vain is like identity theft. It's like stealing God's credit card and attempting to conduct transactions, with a card that does not belong to you. That's what it means to take the Lord's name in vain. It's not about saying bad words or cursing or swearing. It is about attempting by understanding the essence of God to manipulate that knowledge for the sake of an egoic agenda. And so to wrap it up this morning, the world as Christ talks about it is not nature. It is not the body. It is these powers that keep us asleep, that keep us from compassion and keep us in self-concern, and those that keep us, in this angry, discombobulated state. It is the state of exercising apparently free will when in fact we're not even free.